Alright, punks. I'm going to keep this brief, simple, and to the point. There's been another announcement from Punk Central, this time about psychology in Warhammer the Old World. Are you sometimes affected by psychological effects? Perhaps stupidity, animosity. Maybe you're stubborn. Or perhaps you're like me, and you are frequently overcome with hatred and frenzy. Yes, I know this announcement's hardly been fast, but you didn't come here for speed, punks, did you? Because if you did, your faces would be smashed into the tarmac and you'd never be seen again. So calm down. Now we're going to get some sensible, balanced analysis. So let's have a little chat about psychology. I should say that I found this announcement to be the thinnest yet in terms of its content, but it is at least an opportunity for us to take a little wander down memory lane and remind ourselves of the centrality of psychology in previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy, and thus speculate on how central it will be to Warhammer the Old World. So, psychological effects have been a vital thing to simulate in previous editions. Warhammer wouldn't be Warhammer if it wasn't for breaking and fleeing, potential mass panic of an army triggered from a single point of detonation, or a huge dragon flying in and potentially scaring away large blocks of infantry. All these things simulate the fluidity and the drama, not just of ancient battles, but also imaginary fantasy ones as well. So, if we go back into the dim and distant land where it all began, and consider the importance of psychology in old editions such as 3rd Ed, well, they were central. They included all manner of different tests, including for things that were at the games master's discretion. Panic was also very developed, and potentially triggered for more things, such as fleeing friends within 4 inches. Even in 6th edition and 7th edition, psychology was extremely important, especially things like fear, which could cause such reactions as the dreaded auto-rout if you were outnumbered. In 8th edition, psychology was slightly toned down. Fear and terror in particular given a really large nerf. But panic seemingly still being rather important, even though of course you've got rerolls from your battle standard bearer, which made, in effect, troops less likely to panic and flee than they were in previous editions. So let's have a look at some of these psychological effects in a bit more detail. Now, they've only said something about some of them. The first of them is fear. So they say that with fear, you have to take a leadership test in order to charge a fear-causing enemy with a lower unit strength. Now, first of all, that suggests that unit strength, a concept from 6th edition, and loosely in other editions as well, is back. Now, of course, in 6th edition, where fear was really important, you had to take a fear test, whatever the unit strength of that you were charging, in order to be allowed to charge it. Now it's just for a higher unit strength, which seems to be quite realistic. Why a single unit of Chaos Warriors should have to take a fear test if it charges 1 skeleton warrior. Now it doesn't, only if the skeletons outnumber them. It also talks about leadership tests in combat, and if you fail it, you're being given a -1 to hit penalty. Now in 8th Ed, all Fear was a combat test, and it reduced you to weapon skill 1 if you failed, which usually amounted to -1 to hit, and probably +1 to hit from the enemy. So in this, it seems to be a bit more extensive in its effects, because it actually affects whether you can charge or not. Ditto for terror. Now this was something that was removed in 8th Ed. Terror only worked when the enemy, like a big dragon, charged you, and then you had to take a test, and if you failed it, you auto-routed. Now you also seemingly have to take a test to charge the dragon, or indeed just a fear-causing enemy. Terror also applies a -1 leadership penalty if you were in combat with a terror-causing monster, and that's quite important when you consider that, according to the last announcement, all troops are being given an effective form of stubborn before they break and flee. So therefore, having that big monster in there is going to make it a little bit more likely that they fail that sort of steadfast, automatic, stubborn leadership test and actually break and flee, as opposed to giving ground in good order, falling back in good order and giving ground. They say a little bit about frenzy as well, and perhaps that's where that caught my eye the most. Now, frenzy in previous editions had changed a little bit. Now, from 5th edition onwards, frenzy applied automatically. That is to say that berserkers began the game in a frenzied state, rather than simply acquired it when they went in potential charge range of the enemy. But the most important thing it says about this is frenzied troops are obliged to charge if they can. In previous editions, the berserkers were allowed to take a leadership test to restrain their frenzy. Now they have to auto-charge. Now, this is really interesting, because remember, charge reigns are randomized, and so effectively you're going to have to, I suppose, test if your unit is within a theoretical charge range, i.e. you rolling a 6 on your maximized dice roll, your 2d6 picking the highest 2, or your 3d6 picking the highest 3. And then if you are within that potential maximized roll, for example, knights being 20 inches or infantry being 10 inches, then you might well have to declare this charge, and that has very, very important implications. Frenzied troops had obviously quite a large disadvantage by occasionally being made to charge whether you wanted to or not. Now, if they're always made to charge no matter what, it would seem to me on a superficial analysis to make, for example, something like Skull Crushers of Khorne massively vulnerable to having something like light cavalry placed in front of them at their maximum theoretical charge distance, thus obliging them to charge no matter what. Now, of course, that theoretical charge distance also includes wheeling as well during charges, so I don't know how much theoretical measuring of potential maximized charge distances of units that there's going to be. That sounds like it could be a rather lousily written rule to me, but of course the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. Now, they also say really nothing about panic. Now, panic has been mentioned in former announcements, so we can speculate that it's in. Now, panic in 8th edition was, as I say, minimized by allowing the battle standard bearer for you to re-roll panic tests. But in previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy, before the BSB allowed you to do that, when the BSB just allowed you only to reroll break tests, panic was absolutely vitally important. Previous editions had you taking panic tests in combat if troops within 12 inches actually broke and fled. So potentially one single routing unit could detonate an enormous swing in a battle. 8th edition toned this down somewhat, but panic still remained important. It will be interesting to see how swingy they make this, because their own close combat rules, which of course have given all troops a form of stubborn, have probably made close combat less swingy in its nature by giving all troops this form of steadfast, thus making breaking and fleeing inherently less likely. Now, if you've got a terror-causing monster and he makes you take that leadership test on an 8, that's going to be the same test as if you were absolutely thumped in combat by my night bus for you to break and flee. In a comparative sense, that seems to advantage the terror-causing monster quite considerably. It doesn't, of course, say anything about potential terror auras, because in previous editions before 8th edition, terror-causing monsters made troops within 8 inches or 6 inches take automatic leadership tests or they ran away. That was also a potentially very interesting effect and a very powerful one. No mention of that here. However, the fact that they've mentioned other rules as well, such as stubborn, I'm not quite sure what that would mean now, because all troops have got a sort of an effective form of stubborn. Hatred, which used to mean rerolls to hit in some previous editions, but going back into the age of 3rd Ed, had a potentially more varied selection of effects, such as being able to hit more easily, being given leadership 10, and having to charge an enemy as well. Unbreakable, well, I suppose that's pretty logical as to what that might mean. And then stupidity, an old favourite whose rules have barely changed. A bit more complicated in 3rd Ed, but pretty much you take that leadership test at the beginning of the turn, or you're not able to act as you would wish and have to stumble forwards or merely sit there picking your nose. So, I think that the psychological effects, the main summary we can really give is that all of them are in, and so the dynamics and importance of psychology appear to be preserved in this game. And from some of what they write about things like fear, potentially it's going to be more important than it was before, perhaps taking a halfway house between 8th Ed and 6th and 7th edition. As far as I'm concerned, all of that looks relatively good, although I do have some slight doubts about this obligation on frenzied troops to always charge. That does seem really rather simplistic to me. Frenzied troops appear to just simply be getting their old benefits of +1 attack and immunity to psychology. If you're going to always make them charge, I do rather speculate that it perhaps might have been better to have doubled up the number of attacks frenzied troops got, which was the case, of course, in 5th edition and previously. It seems that frenzied troops thus are getting rather a major nerf, but I will be interested to see whether they are obliged to overrun or not when they wipe out an enemy. One of the biggest disadvantage of frenzied troops in editions of Warhammer Fantasy before was that they were obliged to both pursue and indeed overrun if they wiped out an enemy. This meant that you could put a rubbishy kind of weak unit in front of the berserkers and then they would have to overrun, thus exposing potentially their flank to a countercharge, which was one of the reasons why frenzied troops were generally a bit of a liability in high-level play, apart from when frenzied troops were so good, such as Witch Elves or Juggernauts of Khorne, that they merited their own inclusion regardless of those unreliabilities and effects. Now, there are a few other things in this article as well that are merit-worthy in terms of speaking about. One of them is about falling back. Now, we speculated a lot last time about what exactly this falling back in good order would mean and how it was different from giving ground reluctantly. Now, the giving ground point simply means you are pushed 2 inches backwards, and the pursuers, if you want to call them that, can choose to follow up or can choose simply to stay put, which means that you can have that combat potentially breaking up, even if the troops don't actually flee. Falling back in good order, note, is really a sort of less controlled pushback, where troops roll 2d6 and pick the lowest one, and then sort of auto-rally after that's happened. So the troops could be pushed back anywhere between 1 and 6 inches, and of course the pursuers, if you want to call them that, will get all their charging bonuses. Those distinctions between giving ground reluctantly and falling back seem relatively minor on paper to make a really big deal out of in these rules, but I think that when we see the actual rules in their final form, they probably will mean a little bit more than they do seem on paper. And as I said, it's one of the dynamics that I'm the most excited about, this potential pushing back, breaking out of combat, and indeed these distinctions between giving ground and falling back in good order. They mention a few other things, for example, fleeing troops actually pivoting and walking around or running around impassable terrain rather than bouncing through it, and also taking wounds if they go through enemy units in perhaps the same way as they did before with dangerous terrain. Now, note that troops that were fleeing and how they moved was a very important part of high-level play in previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy. So, for example, if you placed a unit in front of your opponent's main threat and he charged it, your unit could potentially bounce through several of your units when it fled, thus creating a strange bounce-a-thonic kind of change where you found that the fleeing unit actually ended up on the other end of the battlefield and the pursuers had no chance of catching them. This was a potentially quite gamey kind of effect, but was very important in high-level play, especially when immune to psychology troops were involved, because fleeing units could bounce through them and they suffer no ill effects for those friends fleeing through their ranks. So we'll have to see what they do about that. Again, it's not really clear from this announcement how all of that will feature. There are also a few little kind of amendments that they put in that are also important to talk about. Not really about psychology, but hey, they're part of the announcement. The first one is the first unit profile that we have seen in the shape of the dragon ogre shaggoth. Now, the shaggoth was a little bit of a crappy monster that appeared in 6th edition. Well, it wasn't crap in 6th edition, it was actually quite good. But in 8th ed, it was kind of garbage. And I say that as a Warriors of Chaos player, and in general, a fan of dragon ogres. So we see here that the dragon ogre shaggoth has got a profile that's really pretty identical to what it was in 8th edition. And we find that it has a variety of special rules. The first being Armor Bane 2. Now, I don't understand the distinction between Armor Bane and Armor Piercing. The shaggoth has a strength of 6, which would normally mean it knocked down your armor save by 3. Perhaps the shaggoth only knocks your armor save down by 2 instead of 3. I don't understand, as I say, the distinction between armor bane and armor piercing. Armored hide 2, I would speculate that's just like scaly skin. Close order, which is an allusion to the movement before, it's what we would expect. We would expect something like a monster to fight in close order rather than open order, I suppose, even though it's an individual model. Ensorcelled weapons. Perhaps the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth has broken into the Skullcrusher's bedroom and stolen one of his ensorcelled axes. I'm not quite sure what that means. Perhaps it just means he's got magic attacks. The Shaggoth is also immune to psychology, which is perhaps relevant here, just like he used to be, and has the traditional rules about storm calling. Now, this used to be that if dragon ogres were hit by lightning attacks, they gained frenzy. Perhaps it's something like this, although he also has a rule called the Quickening Storm. I'm not sure how that's different to Storm Call. Now, the dragon ogre's stomp attacks are only d3 plus 1 rather than d6 as they used to be before. So superficially, that makes the thunder stomp of a dragon ogre shaggoth less effective than in previous editions such as 8th edition. Now, one thing that I would say about the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth stat line is it does look rather weak. Now, let's consider some of the relative advantages and disadvantages monsters appear to be facing in this edition. Now, the first is an advantage. They are causing terror, and terror seems to be more effective than before. That's good news for Mr. Shaggoth. But infantry are getting extra attacks even if they're not in base-to-base contact. And one of the key points about a monster in previous editions was that it got a lot of attacks in a relatively small unit footprint. And so maybe only about 4 guys could swing at the monster, whereas he had quite a lot of attacks against the enemy. Now in 8th edition, one of the reasons why monsters were generally a bit weak was because the second rank could fight, and so the monster was taking a lot more attacks back than he was before. Now, while the second rank can't fight, all of the frontage can, and so your Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, on whatever size base he is, instead of being attacked by 4 guys in the enemy regiment, could potentially be attacked by around 8 of them, and that's going to be bad news for him, and he doesn't seem to have any kind of profile buff to take that into account. So I'm not quite sure how powerful monsters are going to be from the appearance of this. It seems that they're going to be powerful with psychology, but perhaps their actual combat potential, with only d3 plus 1 thunderstomps and no real profile boost from an edition where monsters were notoriously weak, seems a little bit disappointing for lovers of monsters. But, as I have said before, all this is speculation, and it entirely depends how powerful those infantry really end up being. The next thing we see, or indeed the last thing that we see, is another one of these wonderful spells. And this one is called Battle Lust. Rage builds within those near to the Dark Mage, filling them with a terrible lust for bloodshed. Again, that sounds a bit ChatGPT to me. I think I could have written rather a better description than that. Anyway, this one is cast on a 9+, which means it might be rather harder to get with these 2d6 casting values. However, the effect is really rather powerful. A friendly unit gains Frenzy and Hatred. Now, that's very intriguing. Frenzy being extra attacks, and Hatred being reroll to hit. That could turn that unit into a potential mincing machine. That's perhaps the first spell that I've actually seen that would have been powerful in 8th edition. So, that spell, as I say, seems quite good. Although it perhaps would have been interesting if they'd let you cast it on enemy as well as yourself, because spells that enable enemy units to be frenzied are potentially a very interesting double-edged sword, as those who dabbled with the lore of Slaanesh in 8th edition, where there was a spell called Hysterical Frenzy, will know. While giving extra attacks to your guys was generally how it was used, it could also be used to give those extra attacks to the enemy, but make them do crazy things. Oopsie, I couldn't leave without remarking on 2 pieces of wargaming news from the world of Dr. Blackcell. So the first is that I attended a tournament at the Mini Wargaming Bunker in Welland in Canada, the Square-based Grand Tournament organised by Van Heffelfinger of the Square-based YouTube channel. And at this tournament, where I took my Bretonians, Chantal the Prophetess and Pierre Mellon the heroic killing blow Duke, I had a very interesting time, and I got to at least temporarily immerse myself in the wargaming culture of another country. Many of the people at this tournament, from Canada and the United States, had travelled a very long way to play Warhammer 8th edition, perhaps for the last time before Warhammer the Old World, or maybe because they still really like the old ways. I think I might make a little video telling you about what happened to me, and indeed my Bretonians, at this intriguing event. The second thing is also about Warhammer 8th edition, and that's that I, Dr. Blackcell, and my friends Noffles Silvertop and D6 Wounds are organising another London Legends 8th edition event on the last weekend of April, which will be 2,500 points, 5 rounds of the old classic 8th edition fantasy using the Triple Crown comp system. At the time of recording, 16 of those 40 tickets are still available. So if you fancy a little sally into the old world, or you're just a little bit stubborn, then you can come along to that. and we can talk and grumble together. Alright, punks. End of transmission. Back on the road.